What the hell is going on?
You're in my world now.
No, that can't be possible. I was just here sitting on the couch when...
How sweet! Nerd meat!
So what happens now? You kill me?
No, I'm gonna make you play one of the worst games on the NES.
No. God, no, not Amagon.
What's Amagon? I was talking about A Nightmare on Elm Street on the NES.
Oh. Okay, no problem.
I feed on fear. It's your fear that makes me strong. And wait, what?
Yeah, no problem. In fact, it's one of my favorite games on the system, and let me tell you why.
Great, a Game Genie review. Now I'm the one trapped in a nightmare.
A Nightmare on Elm Street was the slasher film that built New Line Cinema into the media juggernaut that went on to make the Lord of the Rings trilogy. The house that Freddy built took a chance on a concept conceived by Wes Craven after he had read articles about university students that had died of fright in their sleep. His design of the iconic Freddy Krueger was also extremely interesting, as he modeled him after a homeless person he had spied from his bedroom window as a child that had scared him. The costume for Freddy, more specifically, the sweater, was based on research that showed the colors that clashed the most and were the most offensive to the senses were red and green. Take that, Christmas. I could go on and on about this, but maybe if I started doing movie reviews someday, this information would be better suited to that. The original film told the story of a boogeyman named Freddy Krueger who came after you in your dreams, and if you died in your dreams, you died for real. Truly a silly concept, but honestly also a little brilliant because everybody needs to sleep. It's as base a human necessity as breathing air or eating food. It's something that has to happen, and we lack the most control over our situation while we sleep. The film was a major success for New Line, and it went on to become a cultural phenomenon, with Freddy Krueger becoming as iconic as Ronald McDonald, although arguably Ronald has killed thousands, if not millions, more than Freddy. With this success, branding wasn't far behind, as Freddy got a spin-off TV series, merchandise, and of course, there had to be a video game, because everything was a video game at that time. The rights somehow ended up in the hands of LJN, like pretty much every other movie franchise at that time. Why? Well, because LJN was actually owned by MCA. You know, that MCA, and they had the money and resources to acquire the licensing rights to these properties and turn them around in a quick fashion to cash in. Some of the games, I'll admit, were bad because of rushed production schedules, but some were merely misunderstood. A Nightmare on Elm Street sits kinda in the middle of that pile, but we will discuss that later. The misunderstood thing about LJN is they weren't developing these titles, but merely a publisher, and they often outsourced to smaller companies to make their games for them. LJN optioned out A Nightmare on Elm Street to Rare for development. Yeah, the same company that made Battletoads. Are you surprised yet? Well, probably not, because there are probably 10,000 videos on YouTube who already told you that. Look closer at the similarities between the character sprites from Battletoads and Nightmare, and you can see it. It's actually weird to see that companies can be picked out simply by design elements, but there it is. The game was released in October 1990 and wasn't a huge commercial success. I can't say exactly why, other than assuming that due to its source material, it was viewed to be too adult and graphic and not kid-friendly, so it wouldn't be carried by some stores. Today it is regarded as the rarest and most sought after of the LJN releases on the Nintendo Entertainment System.
So you were telling me my game is sought after? I thought everyone hated it.
Oh no, they do. But that's because of the angry video game nerd.
Maybe it's time he had a nightmare. One that he would never wake up from.
Nah, don't do that. He's kinda like a national treasure. Let me explain why people do have a problem.
A Nightmare on Elm Street on the NES is by no means a perfect game, and it has some pretty glaring problems that people focus on or misunderstand, which gives it its bad name. First of all is the controls. Man oh man, are these controls irritating at times. The biggest culprit is the jumping, as it can be described as floaty, and even that is giving it credit. When you jump, it seems very unrealistic, and you have almost zero control on how and where you are going to land, which leads into many uncontrollable jumps directly into an oncoming enemy. This wouldn't be such an issue, but there is some very complicated and necessary platforming that you will have to undertake as the game progresses. Next up is the attack. Sometimes, and I mean sometimes, I see an enemy coming, I ready myself to attack, I press the button at what I feel is the exact right moment, but it's too late and I'm hit. It's almost like you have to press the button slightly before in order to make contact at the right time. Even when you do it right, your attack doesn't seem to do anything, and you have to hit the enemy like a million times in order for your character to take down the enemy. Speaking of not making any sense is the enemies. I mean, you're playing a Nightmare on Elm Street. Why am I fighting zombies, bats, rats, spiders, and all kinds of other crazy things I don't remember from the movies? I came to kill Freddy. I want to kill Freddy. Where's Freddy? Well, it's a platforming game, and you need obstacles and enemies to impede your path, and it can't be the final boss at the beginning of the game. The same argument was made about Friday the 13th on the NES, and where this game differs is that in the Nightmare world, while these characters aren't canon, they are possible. Freddy jumps in other people, or creates representations of himself to scare the teenagers, so let's give this one a pass. Next up is the concept. Not so much today, but back when I was a kid, the idea in a platformer was to get from A to B. This game doesn't serve that up to you on a dish, but makes you think, and kids back in the day hated to think.
Hell, they hate to think as adults too. How else do you explain President Trump?
Anyways...
Nightmare is a creative game in that it isn't straightforward. As a kid, I remember starting on the street and walking directly to the other side, where it just stops. Okay, what happens now? Why don't I face the boss? Go to the next level. Now what I didn't understand was I had to go into one of the houses, so I'll press up and go into the first house, which may work, may not. You see, the order that you enter the houses is random. The first level is always the first level, but the house you enter to play it changes, so you have to try all three. As you progress, it becomes a little more straightforward, but starting out, this is majorly confusing, especially for a kid who doesn't know how to think outside the box yet in video games. When you do get into the house and start the first level, you can get to the end, but you still can't pass. What you may have missed was you had to collect the bones. Once you have all the bones in the level, the exit clears up and you can move forward. Basically, this game is a cryptic mess. The last piece that makes the game confusing is that it has a counter, and when it reaches the end, you enter a sleep state, where the background changes and the enemies get more difficult. If you stay in this state for too long, you are taken away from the level and go one-on-one with the man himself, Freddy Krueger. So it's not bad enough that you are walking around in the confusing game world with confusing controls, but then it gets harder and you have the constant anxiety that Freddy could come and end your game at any point.
That's right, I feel your anguish. You are all my children now.
What a weird thing to say.
You don't have anything positive to say about it. It truly is a nightmare.
No, this is the part where it's misunderstood.
Where to start? Well, let's start where the game starts us off, on the street. While most gamers expect to have a very straightforward experience in games as kids, Rare decided to do something very different here. Take the iconic Elm Street that has been the focus of the movies but never really explored, and do just that, but in a very unique way by using it as the game's overworld, or to be more clear, world map. We get to see Elm Street explored like it has never been in the movies fully, and it provides us with a way to transverse from level to level. Not exactly straightforward, but a cool way to tie the levels together and give the game an open world feel. Why does the house pattern change every time? Well, that's probably just to mess with you, much like Freddy would do in a nightmare, but I'm purely speculating here. So each location we go into is another level, or world within this open world created from the film series. I would also like to take a minute to congratulate them on tying in the locations/stages so closely to the source material, as each stage represents an iconic location from the movies. I'm a huge fan of Nightmare 3 and 4, so it's really cool to see the junkyard here. I do want to take a quick minute to acknowledge the music, as I think it's fantastic and very underrated on the system. I don't want to go into too much detail, as I am by no means an expert in video game music, and leave that to some of my friends like Mike Tindo from Dude You Haven't Played This Game, and more specifically the Pixel Tunes podcast. The one thing I will say is that I love rock or metal covers of video game themes, and I would love to see some more people cover this game, especially the Street theme. It's awesome. Next up is the actual gameplay once you are in a level, which, as I am sure before, has been made fun of, and the joke is always that this game could have been called The Bone Collector. Well, this concept is obviously a collectathon, which I think Rare actually became pretty famous for in later games, but I guess it wasn't acceptable based on the source material. But you know what? It actually ties into the source material very well. Take a look back at Nightmare 3, and spoilers for anyone who hasn't watched it, shame on you if you already haven't. The way to kill Freddy is to properly lay his remains to rest, so in this game we are essentially collecting his bones to do just that. Well, we actually burn them, but we will get back to that. The one thing I can't defend here is that this can be difficult, as some bones are in difficult spots or are hard to see, and there will be a great deal of backtracking to find them if you miss one, so memorization is key. The attacking and platforming can be frustrating, like I mentioned earlier, and the enemies are non-stop, so be prepared to let some expletives fly. This only gets worse as the counter counts down and you transition into the Dream World version of the level, which I think is a very cool concept, but it does make the enemies harder. The mistake I made as a kid, and I'm sure most people also did unless they read the manual, was that in the Dream World you actually had the ability to transform your character into one of 3 different powered warrior versions of yourself, as either athlete, ninja, or wizard. Again, harkening back to my favorite movies from the series, your character can become more than himself in the Dream World. This option isn't available from the start, and you had to collect the corresponding icons in the level to transform once in the dream state. The cool thing is that these are more than just a character skin swap, and change the way your character controls completely, and actually the game is designed to accommodate this. As the athletic character, your jumping changes slightly, and you now have a projectile which looks like a mini javelin you can throw. As the ninja, you also have a projectile in the form of a throwing star, but more importantly, you also have a second attack that corresponds with your jump in the form of a ninja kick, which becomes the primary attack I use on the bosses. Last but not least is the wizard. I call him the Wizard Master, harkening back to Will in Nightmare 3. The wizard is the most interesting, as he by far has the most powerful projectile attack, and most importantly provides a floating-like jump ability similar to the princess in Mario 2, which makes some of the more complex platforming a breeze. These powers are only available in the dream state or in a boss fight, which I'm assuming is like immediately entering into a dream. You initiate the change by pressing the select button, and you can scroll through your powers by continuing to press it. The great thing about these powers is they are there to help, but not necessary to move forward in the game. I see a lot of challenge videos up on YouTube, but never this game, as it provides ample opportunity for someone to try and run it without using the nightmare powers. That's right, I'm calling out you hardcore gamers like the crew from Multitapped. I'm sure either Benny or Jason could do this. What is the difficulty like? Well, I would put it on the very hard scale, but then again, I'm a casual gamer, and it really all depends on the way you play. I will admit, the first time I beat this game, I had been playing it straight for about 2 weeks and almost had a heart attack on the final boss. Well, let's get back to what I just said about it depends on the way you play, because that is where this game really gets interesting. For me specifically, I have always tried to traverse the levels in the standard awake phase mode. I do this because when the timer runs out, you have a quick one-on-one with Freddy that really isn't too hard, as he just goes back and forth trying to slash you, while claws come out of the ground trying to grab you. As long as you hit him right before he gets to you, you can pass through him without taking damage. The problem I have is I can never really get a pattern down on him, and I take unnecessary damage, so I try to avoid these instances because continues are limited, and you will need every one to see this game to the end. So it's a trade-off for me, really. To avoid the fights with Freddy, I stay awake in the levels, which makes the platforming and enemies a little more difficult without my Dream Warrior powers. You stay awake in the levels by consuming coffee, or if you are in the dream state, the coffee becomes a boombox, which returns you to the awake state. Both of which are awesome callbacks to the movie, by the way. It is by far the hard mode to play in the awake state, and some of the jumps are downright bullshit. It won't be too bad until you hit the graveyard, and man oh man, are there some tricky jumps here. Another thing I just can't defend is how cheap this game is at times, as the enemies come at you fast and furious, and it becomes the norm to get hit in the middle of a tricky jump and automatically lose a life. What's even more frustrating is that sometimes while you are transitioning from awake to sleep, and vice versa, your character freezes and you are left prone to attack when the transition ends. This wouldn't be such a big deal, of course, but with limited continues, every life counts, and seeing them squandered in these instances is infuriating. The difficulty progression through the game is quite balanced though, as each stage is just a little harder and a little longer than the stage before it. The same concept comes into play with the bosses for each level as well. The bosses are all very different and fun to take on. They use a concept derived from Nightmare 3 where Freddy can take on different forms to attack you. We all remember the phallic Freddy snake that tried to devour Kristen in the beginning of Nightmare 3, right? Well, they are all extensions of Freddy like that. You have the ability immediately to change into one of your Dream Warrior forms here if you have collected the appropriate icon, and I heavily suggest you do, as it takes the battle from super difficult to reasonably challenged. The first two bosses can be cheesed by crouching on one side of the screen while throwing projectiles, which will severely limit the damage you take. After each boss, you will get a key to the next stage and earn an extra life, and you will need it because it gets harder from here on. The third boss is a little harder, as the Freddy glove will jump all over the screen, and you have to time your attack just so in order to make the correct contact and to not take damage. It's at this point I start using the ninja power for the bosses, and the jump kick is key. The next two bosses are very similar, as they, like the floating glove, will move across the screen in a changing pattern. The caveat here is that they will also be able to call upon smaller versions of themselves, clogging up the screen and adding a level of complexity to attacking the boss. The final stage boss before the grand finale is even more complex, as the glove from stage 3 returns, as well as now a floating Freddy head, so we have two large moving objects to attack or avoid at the same time. It's at this point that I tell you that if you have made it this far in the game and don't have any continues left, well, you might as well turn it off, because the last level is the longest and hardest you have faced yet. Elm Street High is the final stage, and takes almost as much time to get through as the entire rest of the game did so far. I find the platforming is at its hardest here, and it's one of the rare times in the game where I will, in fact, risk the Freddy fights to use my dream powers to help. If you can make it through the marathon that is the bone collecting stages, then it's off to the final showdown, and this is epic. I hope that by this point you have mastered the bosses you faced earlier, because now you have to face them again, all in a row, and now you don't get a life for beating one. I can't tell you how many times I've made it this far and died on one of these bosses. It's a miracle I didn't destroy my controller, TV, and everything around me, because the idea of having to start all over again from the very beginning at this point is enough to end all rational thought in a man. If by skill, or the grace of God, you can beat the boss rush, it's time for the final confrontation with Freddy. And it's maybe a little disappointing, as really it's the same fight that you have had with him every time you stay in the sleep state too long. While most people find this anticlimactic, I am still on pins and needles. As I mentioned earlier, I haven't quite mastered this exchange, and still fear that it will all come to an end here and now. Once you beat Freddy, the collecting of the bones is justified as you throw them into the furnace, as the iconic theme from A Nightmare on Elm Street plays. Once again, awesome throwback. Fire purifies all, and Freddy is finally dead. Or is he? Of course, the bad guy never really dies in a horror movie, right?
See what I mean now? This isn't a bad game, but one that's fun and inventive, and I'm not afraid to play it at all.
What? I don't care what you say. I will feed on your fear.
You have no power over me. You're nothing. You are shit.
No!
Oh man, what a dream. I feel like I've been asleep for days.